That's up to you. I don't mind. If any of the audience have something to say, they're welcome to request to join.
Yeah, so for anyone who's listening, we had this. We had a plan to kind of have a mid-conference informal discussion. People can pop in and out and can contribute things they've thought over the course of the first 2 days of the conference, or first half, I guess. Yeah, and just kind of, and also just start a kind of discussion about Kropotkin in a kind of informal, ad hoc, whatever anyone wants to discuss way. And I was going to start it with a personal story about my own first readings of Kropotkin, which might spur on other people to share theirs as well. So I'll just say that quickly now, and slightly sincerely. When I was around 20 years old, I was given a copy of Mutual Aid by a friend of mine who was himself an anarchist, and I read it voraciously, enjoyed it greatly when I was very young. And then I read it so keenly and took it everywhere with me that the book tore in half. So I had the first half and the second half in two different pieces. And I finished the first half, and I met someone, and I guess not at that point, but I started basically one of my first relationships in my life, first romantic relationships, and I'd finished the first half of Mutual Aid, so I gave her the first half to read. So I could continue to read the second half. That was always my nice romantic Kropotkin story. And also that Mutual Aid obviously was quite a big book for me. It got me reading other Kropotkin nonsense fiction.
Hi, here we are. I can hear by my iPod. Sorry.
That's okay. You're speaking as well. We can hear you as well, Nikolai. Do you have any personal recollections of reading Kropotkin? When was the first time you read a work by Kropotkin, Nikolai? I don't know if you can hear me. How about you, Tom?
Mine was actually a Conquest of Bread.
Oh, really?
I thought that was most people's first introductions, to be honest with you. I thought that's how he got most of us.
It was the first Kropotkin's work in your life?
Yes, Conquest of Bread was.
Oh.
I also remember an appeal to the young being very motivating.
Yeah.
Especially being a philosophy student where all the work we do can be rather abstract sometimes. And I always remember the quote in Conquest of Bread, which says, "We, the utopian dreamers, we will discuss the question of bread." And that one's always stuck with me very much.
Oh, nice. What about you, Nikolai?
As far as I remember, it was Conquest of Bread and the modern science and anarchism. And I was 14 years old. And this works impressed me. When I was 4 years old, and it was very excellent. And yeah, I think Conqueror's Bread was really for me some kind of bestseller, anarchist bestseller for me. And really, yeah. And our ethic, as far as I remember, I read when I was 20 years old, and moral philosophy is so difficult for young men like me. I remember.
Ola just told us that his first Kropotkin read was his autobiography. Would you like to share that, Ola? Because I'm actually quite interested in the kind of relationship between Kropotkin's thought and his autobiography, because many of us here seem to be interested in Kropotkin the person quite a bit as well. to a much larger extent than Marxist scholars, I think, often tend to be, where it's all about the system of thought. And I'm just wondering, Ola, whether kind of approaching Kropotkin the first time from the point of view of his life changes your reading and your perception of him. Okay. Ola will tell us about that in a second while he finds a quiet place.
While we're waiting, can I ask Nikolai or any other Russian people that are here, do they ever teach Kropotkin in school?
Kropotkin in school? No, I think Kropotkin is not the person who considered to be one of the classic of Russian literature, you know, in school. No, but but I think it will be nice if it will be okay. It will be okay with this situation. And we are talking about his Dmitri. Dmitri, what is it? This is a story about escape.
It's a children's book, and that's probably what was my first Kropotkin read when I was a Soviet kid in the 1980s, because they published a small excerpt from his memoirs of a revolutionarist as a children's book with pictures and stuff. That because he was in some castrated form, he was a part of the Soviet canon of historical of revolutionary history.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot of Soviet era people's probably first encounter with Kropotkin. It's been published in 1927.
That's really interesting. Also, the association of Kropotkin with childhood, because that's something that I find very often in British sources, that he's presented as this childlike, angelic figure, kind of almost set apart from the material concerns of every day, kind of just floating in this angelic bubble. So the kind of association of false association, I think most of us would agree, of Kropotkin with this kind of bread Santa persona is I think pretty strong. Ola, the autobiography.
Yeah, I might have read a few little. I grew up in Denmark. I might have read a few little short texts from, anarchist pamphlets or something. There was a lot of DIY distribution, translation, and things like that. But the first book I got was Memoirs of a Revolutionist in English. I got the Danish is called Memoirs of an Anarchist, and after that I also read Emma Goldman's memoirs. And I think memoirs are really great way to access political, because you get the political theory, you get history and events and their relations to other, events that happen. That you get that discussions and that personal development. So I think memoirs are a great way to access ideas.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with that. And was there a transition in your thought, kind of when you moved from a consideration of Kropotkin's life and all these many anecdotes about him and so on, to kind of consideration of his thought? Do you remember when that transition happened or how it happened?
Well, I guess his memoirs give you his own transitions, and so you get a little taste of his own different thoughts. So it also gives you a place to start to know what you want to keep reading about. What else was there? Wasn't much in Danish, so I just got what I could find in secondhand bookshops. So the next one was Mutual Aid that I found, because it was made in there was a new publication of it, and a new translation of it. But it's compared to the memoirs, which you can read like a piece of fiction, like it's exciting to read. When you're a teenager, it's more difficult to get yourself to read a book like Mutual Aid or Conquest of Bread, or like it's too technical or boring. But through the memoirs, you get the ideas as well as an exciting read. But yeah, the next thing I read was Mutual Aid. No, actually, before I read Mutual Aid, I myself did some translations of The Conquest of Bread.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The way we kind of, I mean, we were talking earlier in the conference chat about the different Kropotkins that there are, and we've got the autobiographical Kropotkin, who's, of course, I mean, as any autobiography, kind of perspectivized from a very particular point of view. And I was wondering also, kind of, if we look at him biographically, how he changes. For example, if we now have the full correspondence with the biologist anarchist, whose name I can't recall, Marie Goldsmith. Yes, will a side of his thought also emerge kind of in conversation with this person that has not so far been kind of systematized yet? To me, these networks that Sean also was talking about are really difficult to disentangle from the currents of his theory. We have one comment from Anna Nikogosian from Armenia, who asks for Kropotkin material for a feminist library in Yerevan. That's actually another issue that we might get back into tomorrow. Kropotkin, the feminist, big question mark, and Kropotkin and gender. Talked a little bit today about about the garden and the way he kind of sympathetically observed his wife's efforts. But what is Kropotkin's relationship to questions of gender, the power disparities there? It's certainly something that we might come back to.
I think
so
also
thanks, Anna.
his very specific personal relationship with his wife, as well as they were clearly very in love with each other and very loving relationship. He wasn't a very authoritarian husband or father either, but she was doing all of the housework, and he was aware. And I think that you can see in his writings that he's aware, and not in so it's slightly better than those authors who just their wife did all their work and they didn't realize it existed. But he still, his whole career was basically supported by his wife, who did all the childcare and a lot of admin. And when he was ill, she also went on lecture tours and stuff as well. And also she taught science at local academies and stuff. That's what led her to doing lectures on horticulture and things like that. She'd studied and was, something of a scientist. So,
Dmitri?
I just I've missed some of the discussion because of technical problems, and I think someone will have to show my slides for myself because I can't do that. But I want to mention first that Georg Brandes, who I think is a Danish writer, had written a preface to at least one of the Russian editions of Memoirs of Revolutionaries, and also according to the memoirs of Kornei Chukovsky, who was a Russian writer and translator, who translated the likes of Walt Whitman and Oscar Wilde. When he was meeting Kropotkin in summer 1917, apparently Kropotkin went ballistic when Chukovsky mentioned whom he translated, because he was very homophobic and he really hated Wilde personally, and apparently Sofia Grigorievna Kropotkin has taught Wilde's children when they lived in England. But it's all very complicated.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to mention in tomorrow in the kind of discussion about legacy and stuff is to ask how Kropotkin would feel in the modern world. And I think that obviously you're on the right side of a lot of things like ecology and and obviously the pandemic's been a lot of mutual aid questions, but he was quite a sex negative person and was also not openly and not very often, but there was homophobia in some of his letters. And I don't think that he would be comfortable with basically where the anarchist movement has gone. And obviously, myself personally, I feel like obviously he was wrong. But I imagine that he'd find a lot of modern anarchist networks a very uncomfortable place for him to be personally, which is quite an interesting thing, I think, as well.
Yes, and even ecology, I think we shouldn't be too quick to immediately fold him into current ecological thought, because I think, as became clear in some of the talks yesterday, we do get this defamiliarization effect when we actually sit down and read Kropotkin again and notice how much he's still steeped in views of primitive peoples that we might want to question these days. Also in his theories of mutual aid, and also just concrete scientific models of his time, kind of this hyper-positivism that we briefly discussed yesterday, for example.
We will get to destroy Kropotkin in the next panel, which is about his attitude to war, amongst other things.
Regarding the science, like after my second major reading of Kropotkin was his ethics. That because I studied philosophy and I wrote a dissertation on Kropotkin's ethics. But recently I've become interested in his actual science writings, and I'd wish more was published of that. Not just his political activism, but his science, besides mutual aid. And George Woodcock did one short little text collection, but so much of that is missing, because much of his scientific views were views popular at his time, but they were then suppressed for many decades, and now they're coming back in vogue among scientists. And I'm working with biologists right now, and I'm showing them stuff on Kropotkin, and they're like, this is the paradigm that we're trying to bring back. And they're surprised that that existed 100 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, something that Soren also briefly discussed yesterday, these connections. Yeah.
Oh, that's Andra.
Hello.
Hello.
Nice to see you all here today.
Yeah, nice to see you in person finally, Andra.
Yeah. Sean and I talked for a long time via email, like basically for a month now, and never seen each other in person. That's true. That's a little
and
bizarre.
I think that the conversation we were just having nicely segues into our next panel, in that we were talking about the different phases of Kropotkin, the different responses he had to things, and as Dmitri just intimated, the feelings about war, especially World War One, were quite controversial in their own time. And I imagine this is going to be touched on, but obviously when he supported I don't know what the correct term is, supported the Entente, the France and Russia and Britain against the Central Powers of Germany and Austria and maybe Italy in World War One. That split the anarchist movement in half, in that most of the anarchist movement, especially Malatesta, were very opposed to the war and thought that it was obviously horrible for loads of different reasons. But Kropotkin thought that we should be supporting the Russians, the British and the French against authoritarianism in Germany, which I think segues nicely for Andrei to introduce Dmitri. And we've lost Nikolai again, but hopefully he'll come back.
Yeah, okay.
So,
yeah, hello. Thank you so much again for inviting me to chair this panel. I'm very happy to be doing it here. I'm not a specialist in Kropotkin myself. I work on social history of the 18th and early 19th century, but I'm excited just to be able to chair this panel here today. As Sean said, we have 3 exciting papers today to hear and to discuss. And as we have our first speaker, it's Dmitri. Dmitri is a research assistant at the European University in St. Petersburg. He's the author of several papers on the history of anarchism and political struggle in Petrograd during and after the revolution of 1917, including To Beat the Bourgeoisie on the Head, Paramilitary Violence in Schleswig, 1917-1919, published in Abuperio in 2019. The title of his paper today is Applause from the Right, Peter Kropotkin as Anarchist's Enemy, Summer 1917. Dmitri, please.
Hello. I would also need someone to show my slides for me, if that's possible, because as I've mentioned, I've got technical problems which preclude me from doing that. And I've sent them to you, and I've actually seen them displayed when they were trying to get Natalia Mikhailovna Portnova's presentation up. It's called Ivanov, Kropotkin, 1917 or something like that.
Do you have it, Cord? Because
it doesn't have it.
I think Cord shared it earlier on. He accidentally shared your paper or your presentation when he meant to share Italia's.
Yep.
Let me see if he's okay with sharing it.
We have the file.
Oh, my camera just broke as well, sorry. It's one of those days. Are you okay with that, Cord? Are you okay with sharing the slide? Take your time.
Yes. Yeah, I will this time. Okay, it's on screen now. Give me 1 second.
Okay, so a German is showing a slide. A person from Germany is showing slides about hating Germany. It's very, very 21st century, you know. So as the first slide says, my name is Dmitri Ivanov, and I'm gonna speak about Kropotkin mostly in 1917. And I will get to the meaning of the quote that is the title of the paper in due time. But meanwhile, I would say that Peter Kropotkin was or even the recognized leader of the international anarchist movement in the early 20th century. But when he returned to Petrograd from immigration in England, he found himself shunned and even verbally attacked by the anarchist movement that he helped bring to life and championed by the moderate and conservative forces. This paper will look at the circumstances that created such a paradoxical situation, and evidence consulted for the paper includes newspapers and magazines, pamphlets, letters, diaries, and other underutilized sources. If Cord could move to the next slide, I would appreciate it. Kropotkin was welcomed at the Finland station on May the 30th, 1917. All dates are in the old style in Russian calendar at the time. He was greeted by masked soldiers, brass bands, banners, and speeches from War Minister Alexander Kerensky, Constitutional Democrat leader Pavel Milyukov, Labor Popular Socialist Party leader Nikolai, with whom he cooperated in the revolutionary movement some 40 years before that. And the ritual of greetings with banners, soldiers, speeches was by then traditional, and it was experienced by Lenin most famously, and also Viktor Chernov, the socialist revolutionary leader, and others returning from the immigration before him. So this newspaper, Russkaya Volia, Russian Will, has featured him on the front page, and we have to speak about what Russkaya Volia was. It was a newspaper founded just the previous year in 1916, and it was created by Alexander Protopopov, a State Duma deputy, who went on to become the Tsarist government's very last minister of the interior, and he was really hated during the February Revolution. He was executed by the Bolsheviks in the next year, but he was like the symbol of reaction during the February Revolution, and the newspaper that he founded, it was also on the right wing of the press environment in Petrograd at the time. And in the next month, after the newspaper featured Kropotkin on its front page, it also showed Maria Bachkareva, who had founded the Women's Battalion of Death, which was an attempt to mobilize for the war effort, mainly by shaming men into joining the army. Alexander Kerensky, who, as I mentioned, was the war minister, and Lavr Kornilov, a war general who had later led an attempted mutiny against the government. Can we move to the next slide, please? Kropotkin's likeness graced the front page of Russkaya Volia on the 31st of May, and in just 5 days, on 5th of June, anarchist communists from Petrograd have, who were armed with machine guns and hand grenades, seized the newspaper premises just for a few hours, and they were led out by the army, and there was no major violence. But it shows that Kropotkin and anarchists in Petrograd were on different sides of the fence at the time. Pretty much most Russian anarchists were reserved or hostile towards Kropotkin. And in a few months, an American anarchist, Emma Goldman, noted that by orchestrating the October coup, quote, the Marxian Social Democrats, Lenin and Trotsky were adopting anarchist revolutionary tactics, while the anarchists Kropotkin, Cherkesov, Tchaikovsky are denying these tactics and falling into Marxian reasoning, end quote. Next slide, please. Not too much trouble. No? Okay, thank you. And on this cartoon, it shows, it's from Strakaza Journal, as the slide says, it shows a crowd of people greeting Kropotkin, and a couple of anarchists are shown having the conversation, which they say, so do you know who are they greeting? They're greeting Kropotkin, the anarchist. What anarchist? He must be some sort of imposter because he's not seizing palaces or robbing people. So, it was satirizing this estrangement between anarchist movement, which was in the popular press associated with seizures of palaces, and between Kropotkin. There was just one anarchist journal being published in Petrograd at the time, Kommuna, the Commune, and it called in its May 1917 issue for fraternizing with the German soldiers and, quote, strictly distancing, and a quote, from pro-war gentlemen like Kropotkin. And the very choice of the form of address was highly offensive in socialist parlance of 1917. Anything but comrade was suspect. And so Kommuna's demand to sternly distance ourselves from these gentlemen, and quote, Kropotkin and other pro-war intelligentsia, members of the intelligentsia, it indicated that anti-militarism rather than unity of the anarchist movement was now central to what Petrograd anarchists were trying to do. For the Russian speakers here, I will provide a quote from that article. Буржуазные предрассудки и повседневная ложь до того извратили естественные чувства и мысли солдат, что многие по сей час заражены патриотическим сумасшествием, желая кровопролития довести до победного конца. Даже анархист Петр Кропоткин оказался, увы, в рядах шовинистов вместе с некоторыми интеллигентами, считающими себя анархистами. Мы должны строго отмежеваться от этих господ. End quote. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. And in September 1917, the Kharkov, or in Ukraine, Kharkiv newspaper, published by local anarchists, it ran a political obituary for Kropotkin. The newspaper was called Хлеб и воля, Bread and Liberty, and that's the title of the title is the Russian taken from the Russian translation of Kropotkin's Conquest of Bread. It was also used as a name of a journal that Kropotkin and his comrades in Switzerland were publishing some 10 years prior, and that led to the formation of one of Russia's earliest anarchist groups, named after this journal, Хлебовольцы, the Bread and Liberty people. So on the one hand, it was the irony of history in this, but it was also the process of reclaiming the legacy of Kropotkin's anarchism from Kropotkin himself. Next slide, please. So not just right-wing newspapers were celebrating him. He was really a celebrity in revolutionary Russia. But there were postcards published in 1917 with Kropotkin's face because he was all over the newspapers because they were happy reporting about him, about how he was returned and what he was thinking about the events in Russia. He was one of the best-known Russian revolutionaries. But it was, as we can see that on this postcard, the depiction is pretty old. I think he looks slightly different by 1917. So the press has played some role in forming Kropotkin's public image. I don't think he asked specifically to be on the cover of Russkaya Voля, but obviously anarchists who saw Kropotkin on the cover of the paper that they really hated enough to attack with weapons, they kind of associated Kropotkin with them rather than with parts of the socialist movement to which they were more friendly. And I think insofar as his practical suggestions, practical solutions for Russia in revolution were concerned, it can be summed up as a form of libertarian federalism. And as we know, Kropotkin had later joined the Federalist League in Moscow in late 1917 or early 1918. I don't remember right now, and this was rather seen as part of the liberal movement, and it was alien to anarchism as it was manifested in the streets of Petrograd, and because the constellation of political forces in Russian revolutionary ecosystem was such that monarchism and movements further to the right were completely abolished. They couldn't have any legal existence, and many of its proponents were arrested. Liberalism was the furthest current to the right that was operating in Russia, and even though Russian liberals like Constitutional Democratic Party were really much further to the left generally than many European liberals, they were still very much right-wing by Russian standards of 1917, and Kropotkin's association with these forces has isolated him. And if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this doesn't mean that anarchists were not using Kropotkin. At the time, they were really happily publishing his old works because they were kind of they were circulated as sort of public domain works within the movement, and it was really. Quite a few of them have been either written in Russian or translated into Russian, so they could do it. But his newer pieces were generally contributed to specifically liberal publications such as the Russkie Vedomosti, Russian Gazette, a liberal newspaper in Moscow, which, if we move to the next slide, it will show, that's the book cover of his collected articles. I don't have a cover, but I've got the book itself. It's a collection of newspaper columns that he had initially written in the form of letters to Vladimir Burtsev, a Russian revolutionary who became rather chauvinistic during the World War. And this book, it has been published by Zadruga, which was a publishing cooperative organized by historian Sergey Melgunov. But Melgunov was not just a historian or a publisher, but he was also a member of the Central Committee of the Labour Popular Socialist Party, which was pretty much halfway between moderate populists and liberals. And Nikolai Tchaikovsky, with whom Kropotkin cooperated in the 1870s and who greeted him at the Finland station. He was one of the leaders of that movement. And he went on to become one of the leaders of the white anti-Soviet forces in the northern Russia. So basically, Kropotkin was decidedly to the right of the revolutionary mainstream in Petrograd, at least in the streets of Petrograd. And his support for the war effort against German imperialism was well known through his contributions to the Russian press. And in these columns, he explained why Germany was bound to lose and why the economic and social systems in France and England were superior to them. If we can move to the next slide, please. And in the end, Kropotkin was so closely associated with the war effort that he was asked to join the government, reportedly. There are conflicting claims regarding this proposal, which was not mentioned in the 1917 press, but or official communications, as far as I know. But there are several independent sources of the claim, some of which were made in Kropotkin's lifetime, but that probably just means that it was a story that he really liked to tell. Russian anarchist German Sandomirsky, right in 1920, so whilst Kropotkin himself was alive, he related that Kerensky was so desperate to save the war effort that he wanted Kropotkin for prime minister. But according to Sandomirsky, an anarchist proved to be stronger in Kropotkin than a defensist, end quote. Historian Dmitri Rublev, who had published a fundamental history of Russian anarchism a couple of years ago, and many other works, he took an account by Kropotkin's niece, Ekaterina Polovtsova, rather uncritically, and he even suggested that since the proposal to form a cabinet was made just after the July days, which was an armed insurrection in Petrograd in which anarchists were closely involved, Kerensky wanted to avoid the danger posed by the anarchists and make one of the anarchists a provisional government figurehead. Kropotkin's biographer Nikolai Lebedev was that Kropotkin was asked, quote, to take an active part in administering the country, end quote, could mean anything. And his daughter Alexandra Kropotkin has told historian Paul Avrich about a half century after the event. It seems frivolous, but if we consult documents produced at the time, there has been some confirmation because historian Sergey Udaltsev noted that Kropotkin's diary for July the 20th, 1917, records that AFK visited, which means Alexander Fedorovich Kerensky, the prime minister of the provisional government. And in the diary, Kropotkin added ministry, refusal, end quote. At that time, not immediately after Kropotkin's arrival in Russia, as Nikolai
Dmitri, 2 minutes.
Yep.
2.
Beg your pardon?
2 minutes left. You have 2 minutes more.
Okay. Does mean that I have only okay. Anyway, basically, Kerensky was looking for an education minister for his cabinet exactly at that period of time. And and in this quote, which was from an obituary written after Kropotkin's physical, not political death, it's rather rude. And if we'll show the next slide, we will see that Kropotkin and Kerensky did maintain friendly relations, and they opened some projects together. But that the matter of making him a minister was seriously discussed shows the importance of revolutionary, not practical experience as a factor for possessing authority in 1917. Another factor was his connections to Kerensky, and like many of his generations, he supported the Russian version of Union Sacrée against German militarism. If you show the next slide, Kerensky and Ekaterina Breshko-Breshkovskaya and others have been invited to Kerensky organized state conference in Moscow, and he made a speech proposing to make Russia a republic and a few other things. And the title of this paper, Applause from the Right, Аплодисменты справа, is the conclusion of the record of his speech. And it was specifically the right wing of Russia's political system that was supporting Kerensky in the summer of 1917. And if we go to the next slide, this shows Alexander Kropotkin, his daughter, and she was really instrumental in putting him into contact with English and American intelligence and pro-war propaganda officers like William Somerset Maugham and Colonel Raymond Robbins. She really had been using her father in this pro-Entente effort. If we go to the next slide, which is from the archives of the Dmitri Museum, which we have heard from today already, and he was also Kropotkin was also one of the key figures in the Society for Rapprochement with England. Next slide, please.
And final remarks, Dmitri.
Okay, I've got maybe like a couple of minutes, if that's okay, because I'm sorry that I was taken up by the technical problems. Basically, after the war broke out and Kropotkin's pro-war stance became known, he was booted out of Freedom, the London anarchist newspaper, and Russian anarchists did not follow him into pro-war effort either. And as Sandomirsky had written, quote, "For us anarchists, what more tragic could be imagined than the heart-rending discord that during the war separated us from the most beloved of our teachers and leaders, Peter Alexeyevich Kropotkin," end of quote. Next slide, please. So this is another image showing Breshko-Breshkovskaya and Kropotkin together, and they are depicted as grandparents of Lenin, the unpleasant face of the Russian Revolution. And Russia's conservative and mass market press lionized Kropotkin, who was presented as an example of good anarchist against a bad pro-German anarchist Lenin. If we move to the next slide, his statements about the war were really well known. They were popular. They were even published as leaflets like this one. And he also swiped at Russian anarchists for seizing palaces and villas for themselves. And he declared the necessity of, quote, bold fight against defeatism and Zimmerwaldism, end quote, which he thought was promoted by the German general staff. Next slide, please. But can you hear me? I hope that I can be heard.
Yeah, we hear you fine. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, it's just that my screen froze. The next slide shows that just as The good anarchist Kropotkin was contrasted to the bad anarchist Lenin. Likewise, Lenin contrasted good anarchist Gere to the bad anarchist Kropotkin. And there was some Russian emigre anarchists like Alexander Gere, primarily. They were really critical of Kropotkin and his allies because they supported democracy rather than revolutionary war, and they kind of went into alliance with some Leninist forces, even during the war, even before Lenin returned. So if it's the last slide or the last before one slide, I'm not sure, but I just wanted to mention in conclusion that Kropotkin's links to Alexander Kerensky and other politicians who were involved in suppression of anarchist actions made him particularly irksome to Russia's anarchists in 1917, but the crucial factor was his outspoken condemnation of anti-war activism in which anarchists were militantly involved, and the attitude of war was the issue that split Russia's social democratic and socialist revolutionary parties, and the same also occurred to the anarchist movement. Thank you, and sorry for talking too much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmitri, very much. It was a fantastic paper. The next presenter is Nikolai Gerasimov, who is a senior research fellow at the Solzhenitsyn Russian Abroad House, where his research focuses on the history and political and philosophical views of Russian emigres in the West. He is particularly interested in the works of Maximov, Volin, and Goldman. The title of his paper, The World War Problem, Peter Kropotkin and Grigory Maximov. Nikolai, the floor is yours. Please turn on the mic. The microphone is off, Nikolai. We cannot hear you.
I think he's trying to fix it. Before you arrived, Andrei, Nikolai was having technical problems connecting on an iPad and a phone, but I think he's trying to resolve it again now.
Hello?
Yeah,
Oh,
now it's
we can hear you.
now we can hear you. It's fine, yeah.
Okay. I will speak by my smartphone. I'm very sorry, but I hope that it's no problem. If you hear me, it will be okay. First of all, I would like to thank you for all my colleagues, Andrei, Dmitri, and other. And this is a very wonderful conference. And the reason to speak is really I'm research in House of Russian Abroad because I really interested in Kropotkin as an immigrant, and cause his comrades at the 12th century. And first of all, it's Grigory Maximov. Can you change slide number one? Yeah, they're usually tradition for anarchists. Maybe you know. Anarchists and right. This theme maybe you know, maybe many anarchists thought that our people and people all over the world can change his life by revolution, and the right is one type of this method. At the beginning of the 20th century, anarchists thought that the world faced a difficult political and ethical dilemma. The anti-war discourse traditionally to anarchism has logically always been an annexation of the critique of the state as a militaristic political institution. state conflicts were understood by anarchists as an international conflicts, and it's very important, based on only the interests of the different political elites. You know, presidents, kings, parliament members, etc., etc., and know those of society itself. And it's very important for Kropotkin. The state has always sought to convince society that people are citizens, and okay, if people are citizens, and these citizens, in addition to rights, have a duty to defend the state against an external aggressor. Anarchists, starting with Pierre Proudhon and Max Stirner, opposite this idea that the state explodes society, be sending people to war for the benefit of the political elite. This criticism worked well until the outbreak of the World War I. And the next slide, please. Before 1914, Kropotkin was some kind of traditional anarchist who thought that the war usually is a war between states. And in fact, before 1914, we can find traditional solidarity against war. But the next slide, thank you. The World War was a very strange phenomenon for Kropotkin. He wrote many pamphlets, papers in English, in French, and then in Russian. What's the very interesting? Kropotkin thought that Austrian and German militarism a threat to the whole world. In fact, the German and Austrian states is a danger for future revolution. But what country we can name as the cradle of revolutionary life? For Kropotkin, it's real France. Cause it's very strange, but anarchists must save France for the future revolution. Many my colleagues know this fact in Kropotkin's biography. Next slide, please. The next slide. Yeah, okay. This is a paper from Freedom Journal. Anti-militarism, was it properly understood? And in fact, in this paper, Kropotkin wrote that this war is not usual war between, in Middle Age, for example, etc., etc. And anarchists, and for anarchists, this some kind of war event is a very difficult situation. The next slide. This is from the letter to Gustav Stephan. But for the moment, we must not lose sight of the main work of the day. The territories of both France and Belgium must be freed from the invaders. The German invasion must be replaced, no matter how difficult this may be. All efforts must be directed that way. It's very interesting because this is Kropotkin's position about the First World War. The next slide, Sean. Okay. This is in Russian, very short book about the war in Russian, but it was published in 1916 after 1940 pamphlets. And the next slide. Peter Kropotkin and Manifesto of the 16. Kropotkin was not alone in his position. In this document, Manifesto of 16, which drafted in 1916 by Peter Kropotkin and Jean Graf, which advocated an Allied victory over Germany and Central Powers during the First World Problem. And this manifest was not popular in general for anarchist communities. And the next slide, please. For example, one hand, Peter Kropotkin, and on the another hand, you know, Emma Goldman and Sebastian Faure and many other people. The next slide, Sean. The next slide, please. Grigory Maximov. Grigory Maximov was an anarcho-syndicalist theorist. He was disagreed with Kropotkin on his position about the war. After 1921, emigrated from Russia to Europe and then to the USA, to Chicago. He was the editor of Дело труда пробуждения journal, and his journal it was published in Russian, and I think it was one of the best anarchists and workers journal in Russia in the USA at the 12th century. And the next slide, please, Sean. Okay. Thank you. This is from the Maximov's letter to George Woodcock. And in his letter, Maximov wrote that about Kropotkin's position in anarchist community, about many things, about not popular Manifesto of 16, and in fact, Maximov in fact thought that Kropotkin was alone in his position. And what's wonderful, when started the World War II, Maximov did not change his position about Kropotkin, but about the First War, the Second, the same thing about the war. The next slide, please. Grigory Maximov, and in 1930s, he was a very active anti-Bolshevik. He criticized the platformism, you know, Nestor Makhno and Arshinov. In this year, he was a friend of Emma Goldman. And in fact, he wanted to make some integration of Russian anarchists, immigrants in the USA and Canada. And this is a portrait with Emma Goldman. And the next slide. Here are some his papers of in 1930s, and many of them are in English and no in the Russian. It's very fantastic for our history and historical philosophical scholars in Russia. And the next slide. Grigory Maximov against American isolation. For Maximov, USA's isolation policy is not natural. In a world war, you cannot be natural. If you are natural, then you de facto support one of the strong and aggressive state. For Maximov, anarchists cannot just be pacifists. They need to be on the side of someone who is against a strong aggressor. and anarchist pacifists. You know, for example, Vsevolod Volin thought that anarchists must be against all the states and almost against Russian French resistance movement in Paris. And in fact, anarchist pacifists, in fact, use Americans as relations agent de facto. And the next slide, please. Maximov made very specific revolutionary defensivism. Maximov thought that Kropotkin was not correct about the First World War, but the problem of defense in Maximov is correct for him. What I want to say, Maximov know that Kropotkin's position was not popular. Many anarchists, as far as I talking about, criticized Kropotkin during the First World War. So we need to solve difficult ethical and political dilemma: how to be anarchists and not to be on USA's position of isolation. Maximov's position: Germany, Italy, and Japan are the conductors of fascism as a revolutionary force that restores everything that Bakunin and other anarchists fought against. The most militant alternative to the Wehrmacht army, it's fantastic Red Army. Red Army for anarchists is not nice, is not good, but we must salute the victories of the Red Army as an army of workers, forced to fight the workers of the side of Germany. Only this way, in fact, is the way for the future revolution. The next slide. And I would like to make some thesis at the end. I think World War is a catalyst for political contradictions within the anarchist community. We know about Kropotkin's and his defense discourse, Maximov and his discourse at the age of World War II. And in fact, when we want to speak about anarchists and the World War, we must use these cases, cause Kropotkin's positions. In fact, Kropotkin's positions, on my mind, it's only my opinion, has got the future, and Maximov doesn't agree with Kropotkin, but in fact, at the age of the World War II, he made some strange position, but in fact is a position of defense, I think. And no, the last slide. Only thank you thank you for attention. I would like to end my thank you, Dmitri. I see you.
Nikolai, thank you so much for your presentation. And we are moving to the last paper we have today. It's a paper by Professor Sergey Saitanov, who works at the International Slavic Institute. He's the author of multiple papers on the formation and evolution of political views of Peter Kropotkin. And the title of his paper is The Definition of Anarcho-reformism by Peter Kropotkin. Unfortunately, Sergey is unable to attend the meeting, and his paper will be read by someone else. Who it would be?
Yes, I'm going to be reading it.
Thomas, please, yes.
Okay, I'll just load it up. Okay, this year marks exactly 100 years since the great Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin died. He died shortly after the return to his homeland, and as of this was isolated from the turbulent social and political life of the country. He died with the well-deserved recognition from the Intellectual Society of England, where Kropotkin lived and created his anarchist work for over 30 years. But at the end of his life, Kropotkin was misunderstood by the majority of Russian anarchists. In Russia, his later views were distorted after his death, a result of his hostility to Bolshevism. In modern Russia, the result of his social and political reflections still do not find understanding, either among the majority of Russian scientists or Russian anarchists. At the end of his life, Kropotkin radically reworked his anarchist views and came to an original anarchist concept. There are many controversial points of view, including traditional ones, in relation to both private problems directly related to Kropotkin's anarchist views, and in relation to more general problems that re-illuminate great generally accepted approaches of his social political views. One such fundamentally important problem is the question of reformism. The study of reformism in the views of Kropotkin in Russia until recently were practically absent. True, some Russian authors at the beginning of the Soviet era criticized Kropotkin as a reformist, and due to the fact that Kropotkin at the beginning of the 20th century actively defended parliamentary freedoms and was opposed to all kinds of violence. What can there be in common between anarchism and reformism? It turns out that they are quite harmoniously combined in theory. If you set anarchism as a strategic goal of the development of society and make reformism as a tactic in achieving this goal. Thus, reformism in the social political views of Kropotkin can be viewed by us as a social political direction that determined the late period of Kropotkin's life and worked the evolution of his anarchist views into such a peculiar direction, which we designate as anarcho-reformism. Unfortunately, this significant layer of Kropotkin views practically dropped out of both Russian and foreign researchers. Anarcho-reformism has just begun to re-enter the scientific language in Russia and in higher educational institutions, although it is used mainly in a negative sense when opposed to real anarchists. In social political terms, the term anarcho-reformism, in our opinion, denotes the combination of the ideas of the anarchist ideal as a goal and the policy of reforms as a way to achieve this. In our opinion, it is in this sense that one should understand the social political views of Kropotkin between 1919 and 1921. But such reformist ideas can be found in Kropotkin before this time. For example, in his support, he found in the great reforms of Alexander II to abolish serfdom. Likewise, in his attempted implementation of reforms in Siberia, where he served several years in the Far East in the Cossack army, and even spent time reforming drafts on prisons and systems of exile, as well as a draft of city self-governance. Active by nature, Kropotkin was looking for a practical application of his knowledge and powers. However, these broad reforms have remained projects, and they were altogether stopped in 1867, which is the year Kropotkin resigned from military service and returned to Moscow. But Kropotkin did not completely abandon his reformist views. He simply transferred them to another field. And after this time, he completely devoted himself to science. It was in this field that he gained worldwide fame in his work on ice ages and writing several scientific works on geography. However, the main reason for the scientific studies of Kropotkin was that he considered his scientific research, first of all, as an opportunity to make the life of ordinary people easier. However, since the bureaucratic machine existing in science did not allow this, he resigned from the post of General Secretary of the Russian Geographical Society. Thus, the reformist period of Kropotkin, which began in the corpus of pages, through to Siberia and his scientific service, led Kropotkin himself to a complete rejection of reformism. The pre-anarchist reformist views of Kropotkin were a natural process in the formation and development of his future system of anarchism. Only the realization of the impossibility of achieving practical results in the fields of reform forced Kropotkin to turn to ideas of radical anarchism, in which reformism was dropped for the rapid implementation. The return of Kropotkin to reformism, but at a completely different level, happened after Kropotkin became a recognized theorist and ideological leader of radical anarchism, and it is works on this that remain his most famous. At the turn of the century, under the pressure of the international labour movement, the states in Europe, and above all England, where Kropotkin was in exile at the time, began to gradually evolve towards social states. This forced Kropotkin to reconsider his radical slogans, which called for the destruction of the state, and he began to return to advocating reformist principles. Reformism, earlier than in other countries, became widespread precisely in England, where this trend emerged in the labour movement at the end of the 19th century. This period had a direct impact on Kropotkin, and he began to talk not so much about confrontation, but about cooperation with the contemporary capitalist society. Kropotkin even noted that a new form of society is emerging among the countries of Western Europe, this being a society of equals. In the matter of changing his attitude towards the state, the successes of the anarcho-syndicalist movement in Western Europe also had a great influence. These views were most fully reflected in an unpublished article called The Current Situation. In this article, Kropotkin noted that the minds are now turning to representation in a new form, the representation of individual branches of productive working life. At the beginning of the 20th century, he advocated a war between Russia and Japan to a victorious end, and would later advocate for class peace. Speaking in 1917, he urged participants to proclaim Russia a federal democratic republic. That is, he supported the creation of a progressive one, from his point of view, the form of the state. If in his earlier works, Kropotkin had a negative attitude to political struggle, by the end of his life, his views had changed dramatically. In a letter dated June 17, 1917, Kropotkin even speaks of human and political rights as the highest ideal. He argued that the state should not be confused, as was often done, either with society or with government apparatus. Hence followed the author's conclusion that not every society is a state, and not every government that stands above society is a state formation. Participating in the work of the State Conference on August 12, 1917, Kropotkin announced that at that time, a system of municipal socialism emerged throughout Europe. Whole cities began to be built on a voluntary basis, where workers' organizations, cooperatives, and socialist parties had a predominant influence. He believed that it was in this way that the construction of socialism in Russia should have been carried out. In the speech on the current situation in Russia, he recognized the only possible system in Russia is a system that gives extensive self-governance to the city, sub-region, region, republican, and federal system, an inevitable outcome, and the sooner it is publicly announced, the better. Such a form of statehood as federal republic has undeniable advantages over forms of state power, since it excludes centralization. But most importantly, he believes it contains elements of a future stateless structure, teaches self-governance, and proves that the participation of an ordinary citizen in common affairs should not be reduced only to the election of rulers and attendance at meetings, but on the contrary, that everything must be able to effectively participate in public affairs. This opportunity, according to him, is provided by local city and self-governance, which should be arranged so that at all times individuals, down to the smallest, were possibly freer and enjoy the greatest possible rights. Arguing about progress in history, he proposes not to replace the state with society, but to change social relations and working conditions. This ideal cannot be achieved without strong upheavals, revolutions, which may not be entirely, but partially, and will give the slogan for the next century, the century of evolution. For Kropotkin, saving the civilized nations of England and France in war meant saving European progress, and the possible future anarchist revolution, and consequently the future of mankind. Therefore, during the Russian-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, he was an ardent Russian patriot, and during the First World War, alongside a few other anarchists, came out in support of involvement. He came to the conclusion about the need for state institutions for the transitional period. To implement his idea, Kropotkin headed to the Moscow League of Federalists, setting the task of developing, explaining, and promoting the ideas of federalism and promoting the unification of Russia by establishing a Russian federal democratic republic. Due to his transition to reformist positions, standing apart in the Russian anarchist movement, he returned to Russia in the summer of 1917 and began to gradually move away from various anarchist groups and trends. First of all, this was due to his rejection of radical anarchist anti-state ideas, in view of the victory in Russia of the revolution of 1917. Supporting the new Russian socialist government, in accordance with his new convictions, he supported the revolution. He sought to direct all classes of the population to cooperate with the new revolutionary state, hoping for a gradual reform into an anarchist society of the future. This anarcho-reformist position, which was theoretically developed in several of his pre-revolutionary works, but was not understood by his contemporaries, was assessed by many anarchists as the political death of Kropotkin. Therefore, it is no coincidence comparing the works of Kropotkin in the 70s and 80s of the 19th century, his era of Kropotkin's radical anarchism, and works written after he scientifically substantiated his own theory of anarchism, after the appearance of his theory of mutual aid, in the beginning of the 20th century, which is the era of his reformist anarchism. It is impossible not to notice the constant tendency towards significant differences in the interpretation of many issues of the theory of anarchism. The theoretical search for Kropotkin at the beginning of the 20th century led him to a much greater realism in understanding the prospects of social processes. If in his earlier works he had a negative attitude towards political struggle, by the end of his life his views on this issue had radically changed. Kropotkin reconsidered his attitude both to parliament and democracy, and to the building of an anarchist society as a whole. Parliament and democratic freedoms, like a democratic state, become for him a natural progressive state on the path to anarchy. Anarchism began to be viewed by him as the logical result of these liberal political and ethical teachings, which proceed from the principle of the maximum minimization of the function of the state and the increase of the autonomy of moral personality. However, in contrast to the historical opinion, he completely denied the state. However, in contrast to the historical opinion that Kropotkin completely denied the state, we conclude that his views show a clear dynamics towards the state, from the recognition of the need for the state in his pre-anarchist period, through radical rejection of it in the spirit of anarchist concept, to the recognition of its necessity and even progressiveness at a certain stage of human development. Consequently, at the end of his life, he again changed his radical anarchist anti-statist views to moderate anarcho-reformist ones, in favour of preserving the democratic state as a transitional stage on the path towards an anarchist society. Returning to revolutionary Russia, he revised his views on the state, and from that time on, the social political views can be viewed as anarcho-reformism. This anarcho-reformism can be defined as a social political direction within anarchism, combining the ideas of building an anarchist society as a goal and the policy of state reforms as a way to achieve this. In our opinion, it is in this sense that one should understand the transformation of the social political views of Kropotkin from 1897 to 1921. The line between reformist and revolutionary paths is neither absolute nor dead, but very fluid. But the reformers did not enjoy the attention and respect in Russia, unlike the rebels and revolutionaries. Neither radicals who dreamed of overnight change, nor conservatives who saw loyalty to the past as a guarantee of the survival of the future liked the reformers. Unfortunately, such an attitude today towards reform is inherent in Russian society. We can only hope that the study of the anarcho-reformism of Kropotkin will help at least to some extent change the situation. The anarchist theory of Kropotkin has traditionally been assessed in Russia as radical, always remaining a revolutionary theory. However, at the end of the 19th century and until 1921, Kropotkin's social political views changed their attitude to the state. Instead of the concept of direct social revolution and the destruction of the state, the concept of the evolution of society and the reform of the most progressive forms of the state prevailed. Thus, in the social political views of Kropotkin, not anarcho-radical, but an anarcho-reformist concept began to prevail. Unfortunately, in the homeland of Kropotkin, the ideas of reformism and federalism did not find any support among the political movements of the new post-revolutionary Russia. Such statements and actions of Kropotkin led to his misunderstanding, even among anarchists. Kropotkin's concept opposed the desires of the majority of anarchists to destroy the state, also the aspirations of the monarchists to restore a single and indivisible Russian empire, and even the attempts of nationalists to destroy the empire in order to create national states. Even more so, Kropotkin's concept completely contradicted the dictatorial regime of the Bolsheviks, which built a totalitarian society and state under the guise of a federation. Both in Europe and in Russia, Kropotkin has always stood apart from other trends in anarchism, and this is mainly due to his transition from radicalism to anarcho-reformist ideas. But it is precisely these ideas that make his anarchism completely original, always open to cooperation, and therefore always relevant. Research in this direction can allow a completely different look at the seemingly established traditional approaches and assessments in relation to the social political views of both Kropotkin and himself, and in relation to anarchism as a whole. Of course, anarchism is not limited to radicalism, and this is its greatest value. The anarchic ideas of Kropotkin, collectivist solidarity, harmonization of personal and public interests, equality, mutual aid, responsibility and concern for others, etc., are in demand in the modern world as never before, in a world where ideas of radicalism are giving way to reformism. Right, and that is the end of the paper. I will leave Sergey's website and email in the chat, and he says anyone with questions is welcome to message him.
Okay, excellent, Tom. Thank you so much for the paper as well. So yes, if you have questions for Sergey, please just type them in the chat or send him an email, and he'll be happy to answer those questions. So now we have about half an hour for questions for Dmitri and Nikolai. So the floor is open for anyone who has any questions. You can either type them or just say, oh, Sean, have a question. Excellent.
Yeah, hopefully this is a good time for other viewers to think of questions as well. It's interesting because I think that a lot of the things that were in Sergey's paper were, at least to me, seem quite controversial. Just in my own awareness of older, what's the word? Kropotkin's older work. I don't know much about the time period that he's talking about, but certainly I know a lot of sources earlier that would completely conflict with that. But maybe he changed his ideas at the end, and maybe Dmitri and Nikolai would have some perceptions on that. But my question for Nikolai actually was, it's really interesting how national Kropotkin's thinking is, and it's something that's been noted a lot by a few different historians of the anarchist movement, not about Kropotkin specifically, but about the anarchist movement in general. It's often very focused on the country it comes from. And specifically, you mentioned France as the cradle of the revolution, etc. And I was just asking if Maximov had a similarly nationalist outlook on revolution, authoritarianism, and anarchism. For example, did he think that Germany was an authoritarian country and that, obviously the Second World War in some way could lead on logically? Not that I think you should make that connection. And I wonder also if Nikolai could speculate if this is a 19th century thing that survived with Kropotkin, or if it's something specific about Kropotkin, as I know also that Mikhail Bakunin had similar views about Germany and Russia earlier in the 19th century. Although I notice now Nikolai's not on the panel, so I'm not sure if he can hear me.
You have no idea where he's gone for now. We can re-ask the question once he's back, maybe.
I kind of wrote it as well, so I'll post it in the chat so you can ask later on.
Okay, great. Yeah. Okay.
But there are other questions, I think. Stephen Becker has a question.
Okay, yes, Stephen Becker, please.
Oh yeah, so Stephen, you can either write in the chat and Andrei can read it out, or you can share audio and video if you want to ask personally. But we kind of encourage asking personally because it means that we kind of have more of a back and forth, but it's fine if you want to write in the chat.
So in the meantime, I have a question about something different. Basically, you're very focused on the revolution of 1917, which was a catalyst for the events, obviously, and the war was a coincidence at the time. But can you speculate a little bit what were Kropotkin's views towards the revolution of 1904, 1905? Because again, like, you have that same coincidence between the war, Russo-Japanese War, and the revolution. So what was his attitude towards that? And can we see any kind of early ideas about the Entente, about the Revolution 1917 in 1905? So, yeah.
That's a question to me.
Yeah, Dmitri. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. There's been claims actually made by Paul Milukov that during the Russo-Japanese War, Kropotkin is expressed dismay with the Japanese forces' actions, so that could be described as something that could lead towards pro-Tsarism position. But from what I understand, from what I know about Russian anarchists groups' actions during the revolution, the groups abroad, of which Kropotkin and his close allies were part, they were supporting the revolution. They were not supporting the war. And once again, Dmitry Ivanovich Rublev had shown that the claims made by Milukov that Kropotkin was pro-Tsarism during the Russo-Japanese War, they were not true, and obviously they did not correspond to his public utterances. And some of these anti-war utterances, some of these anti-war statements which he made during the Russo-Japanese War have been repeated and thrown into his face, if you pardon the expression, during 1917, by Alexander Gere, by the writers of his political obituary and so on, because it was obviously for Russian anarchists was the same-ish situation, and there was no principal difference between Republican Russia and Tsarist Russia for the anarchists, because they were both, for most anarchists, let me say, because they were both states and so on. And there was also some form of consistency in Kropotkin's, but there was slightly more of consistency in Kropotkin's attitudes to the liberals, as Sean had spoken at, I think, the study group on the Russian Revolution's webinar. Kropotkin had extensive links to English liberals whilst he lived in Britain, and the Russian syndicalist Vladimir Posse, who was visiting Kropotkin around 1902, 1903, I don't remember exactly. He wrote about his surprise when he was meeting Kropotkin, that he had more interest in collaboration with Russian liberals rather than with the workers' movement, because for Kropotkin, his version of anarcho-communism was cross-class. It was not just a working-class movement. It could include everyone, including the bourgeoisie, the peasants, and so on. And also, at the end of the Russian Revolution in mostly towards 1907, Kropotkin was critical not of the revolution itself, but of the tactics that Russian anarchists have taken at that time, because they preferred combat actions using bombs, terror, expropriations, which was robberies for political purposes, rather than propaganda, agitation, and organizational activities. And also at the time, some Russian anarchists were also attacking Kropotkin for this sympathy for constitutionalism, for thinking that Russia should overthrow Tsarism first and think about social revolution later. For instance, the Russian anarchist individualist Stepan Romanov, alias Betbey, who was linked to L'Anarchie newspaper in Paris, he attacked Kropotkin as непотребный старец, indecent old man, and you can. I'm not that well versed in 1905 revolution history and anarchist movement there, but once again, российский анархизм в 20 веке by Dmitri Rublev has plenty of material and can consult it fruitfully. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom was next. Tom, maybe you can ask the question for Dmitri right now and then pose for Nikolai later.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Dmitri. Thanks for your paper. I was just wondering that when I was reading Sergey's paper, it does seem quite controversial. It's a shame he's not here to answer a few questions. But I was wondering if you've heard of these views before, because as he says himself, when we think of Kropotkin, we think of revolution, anti-statism, whereas Sergey's saying his later works, he dropped these. Is this a view that's prevalent in Russia? Is it growing? Have you heard of it?
I'm not sure, and my perception of the case was perhaps either the Russian anarchists were not reading Kropotkin's later works closely enough, or because some of them have not been translated into Russian or have not been available, at least cheaply. And secondly, whatever his views on the future society, it was all trumped by his support for the war effort, and because that was the crucial thing, and that was the decisive factor, and some more moderate anarchists like aforementioned Vladimir Posse and others, they were not so much for the violent revolution, but they were not as violently attacked as Kropotkin was, because they did not think that just building cooperatives would mean that you have to support Tsarism to do that, or to support the democratic government to do that. I'm not sure if that answers, but I was trying to.
No, it's fine. Thank you.
I mean, Tom, when I was researching for the panel today, I saw that actually Sergey has the whole dissertation, like his PhD dissertation was about this topic, so you can download maybe and read. So it's titled like anarcho-reformism, I guess, so something like that. So maybe there are more references there. So we have another question from Cord.
Oh, yeah. Hi. Also for Dmitri, thanks, by the way, for the paper. Just a very basic one. Was Kropotkin forgiven by the anarchists later on? I was also thinking about all the other signatories of the manifesto, for example. I mean, there are some really noteworthy names among them. How did they look back on their pro-war effort there? And how did it come about that later on, it seems to me, anarchists seem to kind of reverse their opinion of Kropotkin again and re-adopt them as a radical thinker, rather than keeping up this critique of him fundamentally? Well, is that a mistaken impression, and he was permanently banished?
May I answer?
Yes, please.
I think if we read, for instance, Emma Goldman's obituary, which was written in February 1921, she writes that we didn't agree about the war issue, and I have provided a quote from her pamphlet, The Truth About the Bolsheviki, to that effect. But obviously, in the later time, she and Berkman, who were arrested for their anti-war efforts, they made their peace and so on. As for those who also signed for the statements for the war alongside him, I think we will hear about Jean Graf tomorrow. But for example, Cherkezishvili, Varlam Cherkezov, who also signed this statement, I think he remained. He didn't return to Russia proper. He may have gone to Georgia, or maybe he had stayed in London, so he did not have an effect on Russian affairs. And Goldsmith, she remained in Paris, so she did not really have an impact. Alexander Gay was killed just a few weeks after the armistice, so we don't know what he thought about at the time. But Sandomirsky had published his pamphlet about this anti-war effort, about criticizing Kropotkin in 1920 in Moscow, and it's not as hostile as what was written during the war itself. So I think the war was over and people started to gather pieces. But I think one point that Nikolai has made, I'm not sure. I hope that he would be able to hear back to the thing. He said that he quoted Maximov actually, who claimed that only a small minority was verbally attacking Kropotkin for his pro-war stance. But there were maybe just 2 or 3 anarchist publications in the first half of 1917, and Kommuna and Khleb и Volia were really violently attacking him, writing his obituaries and so on, and only the Moscow journal Klich had been moderately pro-war, but not as fervently as Kropotkin himself. There was a small group led by the actor Maman Dalsky, whose first meeting, the Petrograd Club of Anarchists, they held their first meeting at the 1914 Society, which was an anti-German group, and it was formed before the revolution, and there was some small part of Petrograd anarchist movement that was pro-Kropotkin, including pro-war, but for most of the majority, my impression was that majority of the publications, at least they were really, against his anti-war stance. They would, be less critical of his social ideas, of his old works, and so forth. But the war was not an issue that he had managed to gain many supporters, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, just want to remind everyone, if you have questions for Nikolai, please post them in the chat so he can read them later and respond to them later. In the meantime, we have a question from Stephen Becker, who says there were ideas within the workers' movement of advanced societies, advanced countries, backward societies, advanced classes, backward classes, etc., the impossibility of revolutionary peasantry and the messianic belief in the role of industrial working class. This was stated with expectations that revolution would break out in particular countries rather than others. There was a determinism in this form of thinking. Do you think that this was at all influential on his thinking regarding his position on the war? Dmitri?
I don't think I've got any answer. I hope that other people would be capable of doing that better than me. Thank you.
Okay. So are there more questions?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, I don't think Nikolai is going to be able to reconnect. He messaged me separately and said he was trying, but that was about 5 minutes ago. We've had no luck so far.
Okay, maybe I can ask another question. So then somehow it came to my mind. I read an article by, Boris Kolonitsky a long time ago about anti-bourgeois propaganda and the image of bourgeois in the Soviet Union in the revolutionary period. So I thought maybe we should think about anarchism the same way, right? So like basically all the definitions are constantly changing in 1917, so among the population itself, right? So because you're focused very much on these top figures of anarchism movement at the time. What was the population response to this? How did they think about this? Were they very uniform, their views, I mean, or were they different? Dmitri, if you can talk a little more about this. So Dmitri's out too. Okay.
We're not having much luck with the technical problems today, unfortunately.
I have no idea what's going on, honestly. So
I think we kept losing Dmitri and Nikolai earlier on, and that was why we did Dmitri's slides, but we didn't lose him for like an hour. Oh, he's back again.
Dmitri's back, yes. I don't know if you heard my question.
Hey, Dmitri, did you hear Andrei's question?
So basically, I can repeat the question if you want to. So
I remember I heard the bit about Kolonitsky and the anti-bourgeois propaganda, which is a paper that's available, that's been translated into English, so people with institutional subscriptions can read it up. Thank you.
So like, yeah, my point was basically very simple. So you've been focusing very much on these top leaders of anarchism movement in Russia at the time or other places. What about the popular perception of anarchism? Was it so diverse as the perception of bourgeoisie at the time? Like, can actually see it like not being very uniform? Because again, like you focus on Kropotkin, on his critics and so on, but what were ordinary people thinking about that in 1917? Were they just changing over time? Or were they becoming more critical to one or another figure at the time too?
I think that I focused on Kropotkin because he was. This is a Kropotkin conference, but one of the problems here is that mostly it's just the literate people who could write. It was mostly people with at least some funds who could publish their writings and so on. So it's also cutting a little bit. But many of these journals and newspapers that are representing images of anarchism and pitting, I don't know, this anarchist robbers in contrast to Kropotkin. They were aiming at the popular audience, and they were reflecting and sometimes I think creating popular fears of anarchy, and it was specifically due to the mass media role that actions of Petrograd anarchists have been multiplied, усилены, I'm not sure what's the word, strengthened by the media, because they could only publish a small newspaper, and it was not frequent and so on. But when they would come to some building, seize it with weapons and so on, everyone would write about it, everyone would draw their pictures, everyone would try and interview them and so on. So that was how image of anarchism was forming. And for many people in the Petrograd streets, it also depended on the district, because in Vyborskaya Strana, which was the working class district, there were anarchist centers. Anarchists were operating there during the war. They were helping out with strikes. They carried out their robberies with their local mates and so on. So they were local, more or less. But in downtown Petrograd, on the Nevsky, which was bourgeois part of town, they would come there to smash up Milyukov's streets, as happened during the July days, which was this armed insurrection in 1917. So the perception of anarchism and anarchy in the popular press of 1917 and 1917 popular consciousness is something that I hope to address in a paper that I'm supposed to write, because anarchia and anarchism and anarchist movement and anarchism, they were very different things at that time. And anything could be described as anarchy. When when workers go on strike, that's anarchy for the bourgeois newspapers. There's going to be a paper which is supposed to be in an edited volume that Boris Klanitsky is compiling, and I hope that it will be published sometime next year or the year after that. Thank you.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating to read. We have one more question, I think, by Sean. Sean?
Yeah, thank you. I had this written down at the beginning, but because of all the technical issues, I forgot. I was just going to ask Dmitri if you have any idea how Kropotkin felt being in these new non-anarchist networks all the time now that he was in Russia, because I know that it was kind of in Britain it was kind of a rare thing, and that he felt much more comfortable around very radical working class people, despite being around a lot of like posh liberals, especially like the cadets and groups like that.
Well, we can also go back to the spatial issue, because in England I think he lived mostly in Brighton. And that's not a working class town at the time. I don't think so.
Yeah, but I would say so. When I read that he visited Manchester, for example, and he was in London a lot, but when he visited Manchester, he would come to like a middle class debating hall, and then there would be like a dozen riffraff at the back, like mostly like Eastern European migrants. And in London, he spent a lot of time in the East End with like the Jewish community.
But he himself lived in Bromley, and I think that's West End somewhere. Isn't it?
I think these days it's kind of like part of London, but I think back then it was like a commuter town almost, in that London hadn't expanded.
Well,
like a village almost.
Anyway,
and Surrey, someone has just said. Well,
no. It's just that in Petrograd he moved to a flat that his daughter had rented in, I think, Makhavaya, or one of the central streets in the bourgeois part of town. And in the summer he moved to a villa owned by, I think, one of the Dutch diplomats on the Kameny Island, which was where Kerensky went to visit him. And that's also far away from the working class part of town. It was very much bourgeois environment. I'm not sure where he lived in Moscow, but I think somewhere downtown, and the working class districts were around the city center. So I think he wanted some comfort, some peace and quiet, and he could not really achieve that living in a dirty working class suburb with factories going all the time. It's I don't know. It might be one explanation, but I can't think of a better one right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmitri.
Okay, Nikolai seems to be back. So, Nikolai, are you here?
Can I just? I think we're quite low on time. We might, if you could answer a question in like 3 minutes, that would be okay.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think he's still struggling with the connection, so maybe it's better to forward questions to him later in this case.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Unless Nikolai speaks now, I think we should probably wrap up. Yeah, I think unfortunately we should wrap up, Nikolai.
Okay, I would like to thank all the presenters one more time today, especially Dmitri for being so bravely able to answer all the questions from the audience. It's been really fascinating. So thank you once again, and goodbye.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for sharing as well, Andrei.
My pleasure.
And we have another panel in like 2 minutes for mutual aid. I think to get to it, you have to leave this and click on sessions on the left or reception, and then the session will come up in the next minute or two for mutual aid. We have Lydia Gatkin, Tom, who read out Sergey's paper we'll be reading, and Claudia Firth is reading a paper on mutual aid in the context of the COVID pandemic. So a lot of very good modern chats as well. Cool. Thanks so much.